There are actors who become famous. There are actors who become successful. And then, once in a generation, there is an actor whose name becomes almost impossible to separate from the history of cinema itself. Robert De Niro is one of those actors. For more than 5 decades, audiences have watched him become gangsters, boxers, criminals, fathers, comedians, soldiers, troubled men, powerful businessmen, and characters whose lives were falling apart right in front of our eyes. But here is the fascinating part. Before the awards, before the legendary performances, before the collaborations with Martin Scorsese, and long before millions of people knew his name, Robert De Niro was simply a quiet kid growing up in New York. There was nothing about that shy young boy that guaranteed he would become one of Hollywood's most respected actors. And yet, something was already there. Something that would eventually change American cinema. Today, Robert De Niro is 83 years old. And when you look back at his career, one question becomes almost impossible to ignore. How did a quiet kid from New York become the man behind some of the most unforgettable characters in movie history? The answer isn't simply talent. It was obsession. It was discipline. It was risk. And sometimes, it was a willingness to go places as an actor that most people would never dare to go. This is the story behind Robert De Niro. And the deeper you look, the more surprising the journey becomes. Robert Anthony De Niro was born on August 17, 1943, in New York City. New York would eventually become one of the most important elements of his identity, but his connection to art began at home. His father, Robert De Niro Sr., was a painter, sculptor, and poet. His mother, Virginia Admiral, was also an artist. So creativity was not something De Niro discovered after becoming famous. It was already part of his childhood environment. He grew up around paintings, ideas, artists, and the strange world of people who spent their lives trying to turn feelings into something other people could see. But young Robert wasn't exactly the personality you might expect from someone who would eventually dominate the screen. He was shy, quiet, and according to accounts of his childhood, he was sometimes painfully self-conscious. He wasn't the kid who walked into a room and demanded attention. In fact, it was almost the opposite. And that makes the story even more interesting. Because years later, that same quietness would become one of his greatest strengths. Think about what happens when an actor doesn't need to constantly prove that he is the most interesting person in the room. He can watch. He can listen. He can study. And De Niro became famous for studying people. The way they moved. The way they spoke. The way they reacted when they were angry. The way they looked when they were hiding something. Those details would later become the foundation of his acting style. But acting wasn't always the obvious destination. One of the earliest clues came when De Niro was only 10 years old. He appeared in a school production of The Wizard of Oz, playing the Cowardly Lion. Imagine that for a moment. A 10-year-old boy walks onto a school stage. There is an audience watching. There are costumes. There are lights. And somewhere in that small performance was the beginning of a career that would eventually include some of the most famous films in American history. At the time, nobody could have known what that moment meant. It was just a school play. But sometimes the biggest stories begin with moments that seem completely ordinary. As De Niro grew older, acting became more serious. He studied the craft and trained with respected teachers, including Stella Adler and later Lee Strasberg. He wasn't interested in simply memorizing lines and waiting for the camera to turn on. He wanted to understand what was happening inside the character. Why did this person behave this way? What had happened to them? What were they afraid of? What did they want? And perhaps most importantly, what were they hiding? Those questions became incredibly important to De Niro. Because some of his greatest characters were not simple heroes or villains. They were complicated people. People who could be charming one moment and terrifying the next. People who could make you feel sympathy for them before doing something that made you uncomfortable. That complexity became one of De Niro's trademarks. But success still didn't happen overnight. During the 1960s, De Niro worked his way through smaller film roles and continued developing as an actor. Hollywood had no reason to treat him like a future legend yet. He was still one more young actor trying to find his place. Then came a film that changed everything. Mean Streets. Released in 1973 and directed by Martin Scorsese, The film gave De Niro the opportunity to play Johnny Boy, a reckless and unpredictable young man. The performance was electric. Johnny Boy wasn't polished. He wasn't safe. And he certainly wasn't predictable. De Niro brought an almost dangerous energy to the role. But there was something else happening behind the scenes. De Niro and Martin Scorsese were discovering that they had a rare creative connection. Scorsese understood the kind of actor De Niro could become. And De Niro understood the kind of stories Scorsese wanted to tell. That partnership would become one of the most important actor-director relationships in American cinema. But at the time, neither man could know just how far it would go. The next major turning point came in 1974. Francis Ford Coppola was making The Godfather Part II. And De Niro was given a role that came with an enormous challenge. He would play the young Vito Corleone. There was a problem. Marlon Brando had already made Vito Corleone one of the most recognizable characters in movie history. So De Niro wasn't simply playing a gangster. He was playing a younger version of a character audiences already associated with another legendary actor. It would have been easy to imitate Brando. But De Niro took a different path. He built his own version of Vito. He studied the character. He worked on the Sicilian dialect. He paid attention to the character's movements and mannerisms. And when audiences finally saw his performance, something remarkable happened. De Niro didn't feel like an imitation. He felt like Vito Corleone. The performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor at the 1975 ceremony. For a young actor, it was a massive achievement. But De Niro was only getting started. And what came next would turn him into something much bigger than an Oscar-winning actor. It would turn him into a cultural icon. In 1976, Martin Scorsese released Taxi Driver. And Robert De Niro became Travis Bickle. Travis is one of those characters that audiences never completely forget. He is lonely. He is disconnected. He drives through New York at night, watching the city around him while becoming increasingly isolated from it. And the genius of De Niro's performance is that Travis isn't presented as a simple monster. He is disturbing. But he is also human. You can see the loneliness. You can see the confusion. You can see the anger building. And that makes the character even more uncomfortable. Because the audience isn't simply watching a villain. They're watching a person slowly losing his connection to reality. De Niro's performance became one of the defining moments of 1970s American cinema. And once again, he showed something that would become central to his career. He wasn't afraid to play unpleasant people. He wasn't afraid to make audiences uncomfortable. He wasn't afraid to disappear behind a character. And that ability to disappear would become even more obvious a few years later. In 1980, De Niro played boxer Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull. If Taxi Driver showed his psychological intensity, Raging Bull showed just how far he was willing to take physical transformation for a role. Jake LaMotta was a real boxer with a complicated personality and a deeply troubled personal life. The film explored anger, jealousy, violence, insecurity, and self-destruction. This wasn't a traditional sports movie where the hero simply fights his way to victory. It was much darker. The real fight was happening inside Jake LaMotta. And De Niro gave himself completely to that character. His performance was so powerful that he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Raging Bull at the 1981 Oscars. Now stop and think about what had happened. In just a few years, De Niro had gone from a relatively unknown New York actor to an Oscar-winning performer playing some of the most psychologically complex characters in American cinema. But there was a danger. Hollywood could have easily placed him in a box. The intense actor. The gangster actor. The dark actor. The serious actor. And that might have become the rest of his career. But Robert De Niro had another surprise waiting. Comedy. At first, it might have seemed strange. How could the same actor who terrified audiences as Travis Bickle become a comedian? But De Niro understood something very important. The seriousness that made him powerful in dramas could become incredibly funny when placed in the right situation. He began appearing in films that allowed audiences to see a different side of him. One of the clearest examples was Analyze This. Instead of being the terrifying gangster, De Niro could now play with the image audiences already had of him. And that became part of the joke. People knew Robert De Niro. They knew the intense stare. They knew the serious voice. They knew the tough guy persona. So when he used those same qualities in a comedy, the contrast became hilarious. Then came Meet the Parents. De Niro played Jack Burns, an intimidating father who seems to be constantly testing his daughter's boyfriend. Again, De Niro used his famous intensity. But now the audience was laughing at it. That transformation was important. It proved that De Niro wasn't simply talented at one kind of acting. He had range. And that range helped him remain relevant as Hollywood changed. But if you want to understand De Niro's reputation, you have to return to his crime films. Because some of his most iconic work came from collaborations with Scorsese, Goodfellas, Casino, and later, The Irishman. In Goodfellas, De Niro played Jimmy Conway. The character was charismatic, dangerous, and calculating. He could appear calm while thinking several steps ahead. And that quiet danger was something De Niro understood extremely well. Then came Casino. Once again, he entered a world of money, power, crime, and ambition. But the interesting thing is that De Niro's gangster characters never felt exactly the same. Jimmy Conway wasn't Vito Corleone. Vito wasn't Jake LaMotta. Jake wasn't Travis Bickle. And Travis wasn't Jack Burns. That may sound obvious. But creating truly different characters is much harder than it looks. Many actors develop recognizable habits. The same facial expressions. The same voice. The same emotional reactions. But De Niro could change the entire energy of a character. Sometimes he was loud. Sometimes almost silent. Sometimes charming. Sometimes frightening. Sometimes funny. Sometimes deeply sad. And that is why audiences could watch him for decades without feeling like they had already seen the same performance. But De Niro's career didn't stop with acting. He also stepped behind the camera. He directed A Bronx Tale, a story deeply connected to New York and its neighborhoods. Later, he directed The Good Shepherd. This showed another side of his ambitions. He wasn't interested in being only the face standing in front of the camera. He wanted to participate in the filmmaking process itself. And then there was New York. For De Niro, New York wasn't just a place where he happened to grow up. It became part of his artistic identity. The streets. The neighborhoods, the people, the accents, the energy, the contradictions. The city appeared again and again in the stories surrounding his career. And eventually, De Niro became involved in an important project that would help strengthen New York's film culture. Tribeca. He became one of the co-founders of the Tribeca Film Festival, helping create a major platform for filmmakers and artists. The festival became another part of his legacy beyond acting. AP has documented De Niro's long association with the Tribeca Film Festival and its work supporting filmmakers. That is something people sometimes forget when they talk about Robert De Niro. His legacy isn't only the characters he played. It is also the opportunities he helped create. The films he helped bring to audiences. The filmmakers he worked with. And the influence he had on generations of performers. Then came another extraordinary chapter. The Irishman. Released in 2019, the film reunited De Niro with Martin Scorsese. But this time, there was something different. The story was not simply about crime. It was about memory, age, regret, friendship, and the consequences of a life spent making difficult choices. De Niro played Frank Sheeran, a man looking back on his past. The performance required something different from the younger De Niro. He had to communicate decades of life through small expressions. A look, a pause, a silence. And once again, he proved that he didn't need to shout to control a scene. Then came Killers of the Flower Moon. Released in 2023, the film reunited De Niro with Scorsese yet again. This time, De Niro played William Hale, a wealthy and influential man whose actions become central to the film's dark story. The performance earned De Niro another Academy Award nomination. Think about the longevity of that achievement. Most actors hope to have one great decade. Some manage two. Very few remain major cinematic figures across 5 or 6 decades. De Niro has. And that raises an interesting question. What is the secret? Is it talent? Of course. Is it hard work? Almost certainly. But there may be something else. De Niro never seemed satisfied with simply repeating his previous success. After dramatic roles, he tried comedy. After acting, he directed. After becoming a Hollywood star, he invested in filmmaking and cultural projects. And even as the industry changed, he continued working with new generations of filmmakers. That adaptability may be one of the biggest reasons his career lasted so long. But longevity alone doesn't make someone a legend. The characters do. Think about the names. Vito Corleone, Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, Jimmy Conway, Sam Rothstein, Jack Burns, Frank Sheeran. These characters are completely different. Yet all of them became connected to one actor, Robert De Niro. And maybe that's the real meaning behind his legacy. He didn't spend his career trying to play Robert De Niro. He spent it trying to become someone else. That is why audiences often forget they are watching an actor. For a few minutes, they believe they are watching a real person. A real gangster. A real boxer. A real father. A real criminal. A real man carrying decades of regret. That ability is rare. And it is why his performances continue to be discussed. But there is another reason people remain fascinated by De Niro. He doesn't fit neatly into one Hollywood stereotype. He can be intimidating without being loud, funny without becoming silly, emotional without becoming overly dramatic, and mysterious without explaining everything. That mystery has become part of his public image. Audiences know the face. They know the voice. They know the movies. But the man behind the persona has often remained more private than the characters he has played. And perhaps that's appropriate. Because Robert De Niro built his career around the idea of disappearing. The less you see the actor, the more you believe the character. That philosophy may explain why so many of his performances feel real. There is also something powerful about looking at his career from the perspective of age. When De Niro was young, he was trying to prove himself. Then he became a star. Then he became an Oscar winner. Then he became a veteran actor. And now, at 83, he represents something different. Experience. Survival. Longevity. He has watched Hollywood change from an industry dominated by old studio systems into a world of streaming platforms, franchises, digital effects, and rapidly changing audience tastes. Yet his name still matters. His performances still matter. And filmmakers still want to work with him. That is not simply fame. That is endurance. But perhaps the most beautiful part of his story is where it began. A young boy in New York. A child who was not necessarily the loudest person in the room. A boy who discovered acting. A teenager who studied the craft. A young actor taking small roles. And then, slowly, one opportunity after another. Mean Streets. The Godfather Part II. Taxi Driver. Raging Bull. Goodfellas. Casino. Meet the Parents. The Irishman. Killers of the Flower Moon. Each film added another layer. Another character. Another memory. Another reason audiences would remember his name. And that is how legends are built. Not in one night. Not with one movie. But through thousands of choices. Thousands of hours. Thousands of moments when an actor decides to take a role seriously. Even when nobody is watching. Today, when people talk about the greatest actors in Hollywood history, Robert De Niro's name naturally enters the conversation. Not because every movie he made was perfect. No actor has a perfect filmography. But because the best performances became part of the language of cinema itself. You can mention Travis Bickle and people immediately know the character. You can mention Vito Corleone and audiences instantly understand the cultural impact. You can mention Jake LaMotta and people remember the physical and emotional intensity of Raging Bull. That is a different level of fame. It isn't simply celebrity. It is cultural memory. And perhaps that is what makes Robert De Niro's 83rd birthday so interesting. It isn't just another celebrity birthday. It is a moment to look back at a career that has stretched across generations. A career that began with a shy New York kid and eventually reached the highest levels of Hollywood. A career filled with awards. But also filled with risks. A career that included dark dramas, crime classics, comedies, directing, producing, and work that helped shape New York's film community. And yet, after all those years, one thing remains surprisingly simple. The reason audiences remember Robert De Niro is not because he tried to be larger than life. It is because he made characters feel larger than life. He made them feel human. Sometimes frighteningly human. Sometimes painfully human. Sometimes hilariously human. And that is why his work continues to survive. Movies change. Technology changes. Audiences change. Hollywood changes. But a great performance can survive all of it. A great performance can outlive the decade in which it was created. It can be discovered by someone who wasn't even born when the movie was released. A teenager today can watch Taxi Driver and still wonder who this strange, intense actor is. Someone can discover Raging Bull decades later and still be shocked by the performance. A younger audience can watch Meet the Parents and realize that the terrifying Robert De Niro they knew from crime movies can also be incredibly funny. That is the power of range. That is the power of longevity. And that is the power of cinema. So when you look at Robert De Niro today, don't just see an 83-year-old Hollywood star. Look beyond the gray hair. Look beyond the awards. Look beyond the famous photographs. Because behind that familiar face is a career that changed the way audiences think about acting. There was the shy child, the artist's son, the young theater student, the struggling actor, the breakthrough performer, the Oscar winner, the Scorsese collaborator, the dramatic powerhouse, the unexpected comedian, the director, the producer, the New York filmmaker, and finally, the veteran whose legacy is already secure. But perhaps the greatest compliment you can give Robert De Niro is this. After all these decades, people still want to watch him. They still want to know what character he will play next. They still want to see him share a scene with another great actor. And they still talk about performances he gave decades ago. That is not something that can be manufactured. It cannot be bought. And it cannot be created by publicity alone. It has to be earned. Robert De Niro earned it. One role at a time. One performance at a time. One unforgettable character at a time. And maybe that is the real story behind the persona. The world sees Robert De Niro as a Hollywood legend. But the legend began with a boy who discovered that he could become someone else when he stepped onto a stage. From that small school production to the biggest stages in Hollywood, the journey has been extraordinary. And the final chapter hasn't necessarily been written. Because if Robert De Niro's career has taught us anything, it is that you should never assume you know what comes next. The actor who once became Vito Corleone became Travis Bickle. The actor who became Jake LaMotta became a comedy star. The actor who terrified audiences made millions laugh. The actor who spent decades in front of the camera eventually moved behind it. And the young man who started in New York became one of the defining actors of American cinema. So, on his 83rd birthday, perhaps the best way to celebrate Robert De Niro isn't simply to count his movies. It's to remember the characters. Remember the performances. Remember the moments when the actor disappeared and the character took over. Because those moments are why his career matters. And decades from now, when new generations discover the movies that shaped Hollywood, they will still encounter that familiar face. They will meet Vito. They will meet Travis. They will meet Jake. They will meet Jimmy. They will meet Frank. And somewhere behind all of them will be the same man. Robert De Niro. A New York kid who became an actor. An actor who became a star. A star who became a legend. And a legend whose greatest achievement may not be the awards sitting on a shelf. It may be the fact that, after more than half a century, audiences still haven't forgotten him. The persona may change. The characters may disappear. Hollywood may continue to evolve. But the legacy remains. And that legacy belongs to one of the most remarkable actors cinema has ever known. Robert De Niro. 83 years old. More than 5 decades of unforgettable performances. 2 acting Oscars. Countless iconic characters. And a place in movie history that is almost impossible to erase. Because some actors make movies. Some actors make moments. And a very small number become part of cinema itself. Robert De Niro is one of them.